They tried to wipe him out, wipe out a symbol of hope for a whole country. But they didn't succeed. Ibrahim Traoré, the man at the centre of it all, didn't just survive. He stood tall, stronger than ever, like a flame that refuses to go out in the storm. After the failed attempt to overthrow him, Traoré didn't wait around for another hit. He got to work. Fast. He wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about every street, every village, every child dreaming of a better Burkina Faso. First, he tightened the nation's defences. Think locked doors, watchful eyes, and stronger walls. Only this time, on a national scale. But what came next caught everyone's attention. Traoré reached out beyond Africa. He turned to Russia. Yes, Russia, a country known for standing its ground, even when the world pushes back hard. Why Russia? And what are they really bringing to the table? In moments like this, when enemies hide in the shadows and threats don't always come with warning signs, having a powerful friend could change everything. Since that near disaster, Traoré's team hasn't let their guard down for a second. And when whispers of another coup started floating through the air, guess who extended a hand? Vladimir Putin himself. Before we continue, we would like to ask you a question. Do you think Captain Traoré is doing the right thing by letting Russia bring its military and defend him against the West? Let us know what you think in the comments section below. If you've been watching closely, this was bound to happen. Burkina Faso and Russia have been growing closer for a while now, not just because of politics, but because they share something deeper, the dream of standing on their own 2 feet. Back in 2023, President Ibrahim Traoré said it out loud. Russia was a more trustworthy partner than France. That one sentence shook a lot of tables around the world. But to people in Burkina Faso, it just confirmed what they already knew. Because for years, France claimed to be helping. Training soldiers, sending support, offering protection. But behind all that help was something else. Control. And while corrupt leaders like Blaise Compaoré smiled for cameras and signed defence deals, France's influence quietly hollowed out the strength of Burkina Faso's army. People were told the military was getting better, stronger, ready. But the truth, it was falling apart from the inside, and all the while, insecurity was spreading like wildfire. Then comes the irony. French President Emmanuel Macron recently said France built the armies in the Sahel. But ask anyone who served under Traoré, and they'll tell you, what France really built was a military so dependent and under-equipped, it couldn't even stand on its own. President Traoré, a soldier before he became a president, has seen it all. He knows how the pieces were moved, how the deals were signed, and how the country's independence was slowly traded away in the name of cooperation. Way back, after Burkina Faso got its flag, its anthem and its freedom, a shady agreement was signed. In that deal, the country gave France the power to oversee its military. On the surface, it looked like support. But behind the curtain, it was something else. Supervision, restriction, and manipulation disguised as mentorship. Those so-called French advisors weren't helping. They were gatekeepers. They controlled what weapons the country could buy. They blocked access to the tools Burkina Faso actually needed. Sometimes, soldiers had to borrow weapons from neighbours. Yes, borrow, just to face growing threats. And if you're wondering, why didn't the Burkinabe government just say no? Well, that's where it gets even worse. These advisors didn't just fail to help. They made sure the country couldn't help itself. Like a puppet master pulling strings behind the scenes, they dictated what was allowed and what wasn't. So how did it get this bad? Why was Burkina Faso, a nation with proud warriors, turned into a country with a struggling army? For years, everyone thought France was helping Burkina Faso stay safe. They called it a partnership, training soldiers, sharing equipment, offering support. But while that might have looked good from the outside, things on the inside were falling apart. During Blaise Compaoré's rule, France's influence wasn't just strong, it was smothering. Instead of building a tough, independent army, the so-called help from France slowly drained the strength out of Burkina Faso's military. While insecurity spread across the country, the soldiers supposed to fight back were left with barely enough to stand on. Then came a bold statement from French President Emmanuel Macron. We built the armies of the Sahel. But here's the thing. What kind of army gets built with rusty weapons, limited training, and no ability to make its own choices? President Ibrahim Traoré, a man who's actually worn the uniform and seen the battlefield, called it for what it was. This wasn't a partnership, it was a trap. A one-sided deal that left the country wide open to threats, and the problem didn't start yesterday. It goes way back, to the early days after independence. When Burkina Faso became a free nation on paper, it signed an agreement with France. That agreement gave France the power to send military advisors to help train the army. Sounds helpful, right? But what it really meant was France got to control how Burkina Faso's military worked, what it learned, and what weapons it could or couldn't buy. On paper, it looked like progress. In reality, it was a slow chokehold on the country's ability to defend itself. Under these foreign advisors, things only got worse. The Burkinabe soldiers were stuck with old, outdated weapons, sometimes even borrowing gear from neighbouring countries just to function. Let that sink in. A country borrowing weapons like a kid borrowing pencils before an exam. And if those advisors were truly there to help, wouldn't they push for better equipment? Wouldn't they insist on real upgrades and serious investment in national defence? Here's where it gets even more shocking. These foreign trainers didn't just sit back and watch. They blocked Burkina Faso from getting better weapons. They decided what the country could buy, from whom and when. They were like puppet masters, pulling strings from behind the curtain. And the people in power at the time? They just nodded along, too scared or too loyal to speak up. A country with a proud history and brave people was being told how to protect itself by outsiders who never had to live with the consequences. It wasn't just embarrassing. It was painful to witness. The soldiers who were supposed to protect Burkina Faso were living like they'd been forgotten. No decent boots, no solid meals, no reliable weapons or proper shelter. And don't even ask about their salaries. Many were barely scraping by. So when Traoré stepped in and saw the condition of the army, what he found was heartbreaking. These weren't fighters ready to defend their country. These were men worn out, drained, and unsure of what they were even fighting for. Every now and then, a lucky few were picked to travel to France for special training. At first glance, it looked like a kind gesture, a chance to sharpen skills and bring that knowledge home. But there was a darker layer hidden beneath the surface. These weren't just military lessons. These were grooming sessions. Soldiers were being trained, yes, but not just for battle. They were being shaped to serve French interests. Subtly taught to prioritise loyalty to Paris over their homeland. Look closely at the unrest in Burkina Faso today, and you'll notice a pattern. Many of the individuals stirring up trouble once sat in French classrooms, wore French uniforms, and followed French orders. This wasn't random. It was a well-thought-out strategy. A quiet blueprint to keep Burkina Faso within France's grip. If the military could be influenced from within, then real independence would always stay just out of reach. Meanwhile, violence and instability ran wild. Communities were attacked, villages were burned, thousands of innocent people died. And France, it stood by watching the chaos unfold, claiming to help, but never really stepping in to stop the bleeding. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped into power, he didn't hesitate. He saw the trap for what it was and snapped the strings. The colonial defence agreement? Gone. French troops on Burkinabe soil? Shown the door. And just like that, the spell was broken. Burkina Faso was finally free to choose its own future. With the West no longer pulling the strings, Traoré looked for a fresh start. He didn't want handouts or hidden agendas. He wanted partners. And that search led him to Russia, a country that had been pushed aside by Western powers, but was still standing strong. While some raised eyebrows at this new alliance, Traoré saw it as a step toward balance, not more chains. Critics were quick to point fingers. Russia just wants more power in Africa, they said. They're no different. But that's only one side of the coin. Here's what those critics miss. Russia was never a colonizer in Africa. It doesn't carry the baggage that France does. There's no painful history of stolen resources or stolen voices between Russia and Burkina Faso. That matters a lot. France still treats places like Burkina Faso as if they belong to it, as if they're backup storage units full of raw materials and obedient soldiers. But Russia doesn't walk into the room with that same mindset. In this new world, countries don't just need allies, they need respect, the kind that's built on give and take, not orders and obedience, and that's what makes this new relationship different. It's not perfect, it's not magic, but it's built on a kind of understanding that France never offered: respect, equality, and the chance to grow without someone else holding the leash. The world doesn't work the way it used to. In today's world, no country can go it alone. Not for long, anyway. Everyone needs someone. Whether it's for trade, technology, food, or security, nations lean on each other to grow stronger. But here's the catch. Not all partnerships are fair. Look at how things have played out between Africa and the West. The West, especially countries like France, often showed up with smiles and promises, but left with resources and control. The deals looked friendly, but they tilted heavily in one direction. And spoiler alert, that direction wasn't Africa's. Now, Russia enters the picture with a very different background. It didn't colonize Africa. It doesn't have a history of stealing from it. That alone changes the tone of the conversation. Instead of walking in like a boss giving orders, Russia approaches like a guest ready to work together. It's not about dominance, it's about balance. That's the key difference between what Burkina Faso once had with France and what it's building with Russia. The relationship with France felt like a chain, a constant reminder of who held the power. With Russia, it feels more like a handshake, two sides agreeing to move forward together. Of course, some people argue that Russia is just trying to replace the West, that it's another version of the same old game. But here's where the story gets more interesting. First off, Russia doesn't treat African nations like backup supply closets. It doesn't see them as spaces to dump old weapons or extract raw materials without giving back. In fact, the deals being made today tell a very different story. Take energy, for example. Europe still relies heavily on Russian gas and oil, which shows just how strong Russia's resource game is. France, not so much. Its economy historically was built off the riches of its colonies: gold, cocoa, uranium, you name it. While it got rich, countries like Niger stayed poor, even though they were the ones providing the fuel. For years, France took uranium from Niger to power its nuclear plants, lighting up French homes while Niger's people sat in the dark. Not once did France offer to help Niger build its own nuclear energy program. But after Niger showed France the door, something unexpected happened. Russia stepped in, not just with promises, but with real action. The two countries signed a deal to help Niger build its own nuclear energy system. But Russia didn't just drop off some equipment and leave. They started training local scientists, teaching engineers, sharing the know-how. That's how you build a future, not just a facility. And Niger isn't the only one getting in on this. Burkina Faso and Mali, watching what's unfolding next door, decided to follow suit. They've also signed new agreements with Russia, focusing on long-term growth, energy, and self-reliance. It's not just about power plants, it's about trust. It's about one side not robbing the other blind. And when you stack this against what France offered, short-term control, hidden strings, and broken promises, the difference becomes crystal clear. France still acts like Burkina Faso is its backyard, coming and going as it pleases, grabbing cheap resources and calling it help. But Russia walks in differently. It doesn't carry that old colonial weight. There's no history of taking over African countries or treating them like second-class citizens. That changes everything about how Russia does business with places like Burkina Faso. Today's world runs on connections. Countries need each other to grow, to trade, to solve big problems. But things only work when those relationships are fair. And let's be honest, Africa's dealings with the West have rarely been fair. Most of the time, it's been one side giving the orders, while the other side gets the leftovers. Russia doesn't come to the table with that same we know better attitude. Its relationship with Burkina Faso is more balanced, two sides talking as equals, not one barking orders while the other listens. And that's a huge shift from how things were with France, where the vibe was more boss and employee than partners. Now, is this new friendship with Russia perfect? Of course not. But here's what people forget when they criticize it. Russia never colonized Africa. There's no dark history to sweep under the rug. That alone sets the stage for a cleaner, more respectful partnership. Meanwhile, France still behaves like the old days never ended. The mindset hasn't changed. The control, the entitlement, the quiet expectation that African nations will always fall in line. It's still there, but the world isn't buying it anymore, especially not in places like Burkina Faso. And let's talk about democracy, the word Western nations love to throw around. In theory, democracy is supposed to mean freedom, fairness, and choice. But in many African countries, it's become more like a costume, something governments wear during elections while everything behind the curtain stays the same. Ballots get rigged, opposition parties are shut down, and citizens are left powerless. When the West says, return to democracy or no help, it sounds less like advice and more like a threat. That's not partnership, that's pressure. It's control dressed up as morality. Take loans, for instance. If an African country wants funding from global banks, especially the ones controlled by the West, there's always a catch. Do this, don't do that, play by our rules. And if they don't, no loan, no money, no help. Burkina Faso and its neighbours in the AES bloc know this story all too well. The moment they chose a new path, one that didn't match Western expectations, they were cut off. No more funds from the IMF, no more loans from the World Bank, all because they refused to play along. Russia, much like China, plays by a very different rule book. They're not out here bossing countries around or handing out how to run your nation manuals. Their approach is straight up. What do you need? What can we offer? Let's work something out that helps us both. No lectures, no strings, no secret agendas hidden behind smiles. That's why so many people are backing President Traoré's decision to team up with Russia instead of sticking with France. France always seemed to be the one calling the shots, deciding what was best, and treating Burkina Faso like a younger sibling who couldn't think for itself. But with Russia, it's different. It's eye to eye. Side by side, each voice matters. Since the switch, the Burkinabe military has started turning a corner. No more waiting for approvals from foreign powers to buy a rifle or fix a helicopter. They're finally in charge of their own gear, their own strategies, their own fight. And guess what? It's paying off. Out of the 40% of the country that had been swallowed up by terrorists, Burkina Faso has already taken back a solid 10%. That's real progress, and it's only the beginning. It makes sense then that Traoré didn't waste a second bringing Russia closer into the fold. This isn't just about politics. It's about survival. It's about protecting a country and a leader under constant threat. Today, Russian fighter jets scan the skies above Burkina Faso, and elite Russian advisors work quietly behind the scenes to keep Traoré safe. But this story isn't just about one man. Traoré represents something bigger. He's a symbol of what's possible when an African leader breaks free from foreign control and chooses a new path. If he were to fall, that dream would be in danger. And that's exactly why Russia's support means so much, not just to Burkina Faso, but to a whole continent watching closely. And when things got really bad, Russia didn't back away. On June 11th last year, the country faced one of its darkest days. Deep near the border with Niger, in a place called Mansilla, militants launched a savage attack on a Burkinabe army base. The numbers were heartbreaking. Around 100 soldiers killed, many more missing, and entire communities forced to flee for safety. Families were torn apart. Towns emptied overnight. The news hit hard. Site intelligence confirmed the tragedy, reporting that the attackers stormed in, wiped out the post, and left a trail of destruction. A few days later, the group JNIM took credit. Videos surfaced online showing their fighters riding motorbikes, shooting through villages, and even capturing soldiers. It was chaos. Analysts called it one of the worst attacks the country had seen since violence started spilling over from Mali back in 2015. What happened next shook the entire nation. The attack in Mansilla wasn't just brutal, it felt like a warning. And not just to the soldiers, but to the entire country. It showed everyone that Burkina Faso was still in the middle of a fierce fight, and that protecting President Traoré had become more urgent than ever. Targeting civilians is already horrible. But going after trained military personnel and then bragging about it online, that takes things to a whole new level. And let's not ignore the timing, just days after the government extended Traoré's leadership. Coincidence? Probably not. Some people began to suspect something deeper. Whispers started swirling, pointing fingers at possible outside involvement. And not just any outsider, France. Believe it or not, there have long been claims that France has a hidden hand in some of the chaos shaking the Sahel. Why? Because keeping the region unstable gives France a reason to stay involved, especially with troops on the ground. President Traoré has said it himself. He believes there's a strategy behind the violence, a plan to make the Burkinabe army look weak so that foreign powers can swoop in and save the day. If people start to doubt the army's strength, they'll start to doubt Traoré too. And if they doubt him, his support crumbles. But then, just when the country hadn't even had time to breathe, something else happened. On June 12th, in the capital city of Ouagadougou, gunfire rang out near the national TV and radio station, RTB. This wasn't some random incident. The station sits right next to the presidential palace, where Traoré was holding a high-level meeting with his cabinet. Shots tore through the area. Bullet holes in cars, a projectile hitting the compound, and a clear message. This was meant to shake the system at its core, aimed not just at a building, but at the symbol of national leadership. In footage aired later, you could see the aftermath: smoke, shattered glass, chaos. 2 people were injured, but thankfully no one was killed. Still, the message couldn't be clearer. Someone was trying to take out President Traoré, and they failed. The real focus now turned to what came next. Russia didn't hesitate. They stood by Traoré and Burkina Faso like a true partner. At a press event in Moscow, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirmed what many had suspected. Russia was already working closely with Burkina Faso, and that cooperation was about to deepen. Russian instructors had been on the ground for a while, helping train the country's soldiers and police. And now, more were coming. Alongside that, military equipment was also being sent to reinforce Burkina Faso's defence. Lavrov even thanked the country for not taking sides in the Ukraine conflict. But what really stood out was his final statement. He said, plain and simple, that Russia would support Burkina Faso in standing up to neo-colonial pressure. No vague promises, just straight-up commitment. After the twin attacks and rising rumours of unrest within the army, Russia didn't just talk, they acted. Fast. A trusted source from Africa revealed that 2 military planes, packed with Russian advisors, landed in Burkina Faso shortly after the incident. The planes didn't come from far. According to inside sources, they flew in from Mali, Burkina Faso's neighbour, and fellow military-led government that's also grown close with Russia in recent years. Another source backed it up, confirming that these weren't just regular military advisors. These were hardened veterans, many believed to be former members of Russia's Wagner Group, now reorganised under a new banner called the Africa Corps. But their arrival wasn't just for show. Russia was making a clear statement. They're not backing down, and neither is their support for President Traoré. This move was carefully planned. It wasn't just about offering help. It was about standing firm beside a leader who's remained loyal to Moscow, especially while much of the world has tried to shut Russia out. For Russia, keeping Traoré in power is a top priority. He's one of the few African leaders openly resisting Western pressure, and he's done so while extending a hand to Moscow. In return, Russia wants to see Burkina Faso stable, safe, and moving forward under Traoré's leadership. That's why their presence goes beyond military drills or classroom instructions. They're also there to make sure no one gets close enough to take him out. Still, Traoré isn't depending on Russia alone. Even before these Russian boots touched Burkinabe soil, he was already hard at work reshaping his personal security. One of his first big decisions was to overhaul the elite guard responsible for protecting him directly. But this wasn't just about swapping uniforms or shifting ranks. Traoré took a magnifying glass to every single soldier in that unit. He didn't just ask for resumes or listen to stories of loyalty, he demanded proof. Anyone with questionable ties or weak allegiances was shown the door. Only those with clean records and tested loyalty stayed, and even then nobody was automatically trusted. Each person was thoroughly vetted, their backgrounds combed through for anything that raised concern. Then, out of nowhere, came a brazen reminder of why those precautions were necessary. The day after the devastating June 11th attack, around 3 p.m. on June 12th, gunfire erupted right outside the headquarters of RTB, the national broadcaster. That building sits close to the presidential palace, so close in fact that Traoré himself was inside holding a council meeting when the shots were fired. Cars parked nearby were left with bullet holes. A projectile even slammed into the compound. Videos and photos quickly spread online, showing the aftermath, shattered windows, chaos, and people running for cover. 2 staff members were hit by stray fire, but treated quickly by the president's medical team and released. But the real damage wasn't physical, it was symbolic. The attack wasn't just aimed at a TV station, it was a strike at the core of Burkina Faso's government, a direct threat to Traoré, and whoever planned it clearly wanted to send a message. They failed. And as the dust settled, Russia doubled down. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a press conference in Moscow, making it clear that Russia would not be walking away from Burkina Faso anytime soon. He confirmed that Russian trainers were already in the country, and even more would be arriving. Later that day, Burkina 24 reported details from the RTB incident. A bullet had landed inside the station, causing minor injuries but sending a major warning. Still, the response from Moscow was immediate. Lavrov reiterated that Russia's role wouldn't stop at training. They were also committed to supplying weapons and gear, everything needed to boost Burkina Faso's ability to fight off the armed groups terrorizing the country. Whoever planned to take down President Traoré didn't just miss, they lit a fire under something much bigger. The attack may have failed, but what came after changed everything. Russia didn't flinch. In fact, they leaned in even harder, making it clear to the world that they're not walking away from Traoré or Burkina Faso anytime soon. At a press conference in Moscow, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov didn't beat around the bush. He confirmed what many had suspected. Russian advisors had already been working closely with Burkina Faso's military and police forces. And more were on the way. This wasn't just about training drills or handing over gear. Russia was stepping up in a way that showed real commitment. Lavrov's message was crystal clear. Russia supports Burkina Faso's right to stay free from outside control, not just from rebel fighters, but from foreign powers that still try to pull the strings behind the scenes. And while Lavrov also thanked Burkina Faso for staying neutral in the Ukraine conflict, it was his last words that really hit home. Russia is ready to stand by Traoré, not just with words, but with boots, gear, and loyalty. And Russia didn't wait long to show that promise in action. After the June 11th massacre and the chaos that followed, including whispers of unrest inside the Burkinabe army, 2 aircraft quietly landed on Burkinabe soil. The flights came from Mali, a country that, like Burkina Faso, has drifted away from Western influence and embraced closer ties with Moscow. Sources confirmed what many suspected. These weren't ordinary trainers. They were experienced fighters, some believed to be veterans of Russia's Wagner Group, now operating under a rebranded force known as the Africa Corps. Their mission? Not just to teach combat skills, these men had a much bigger role: to help guard President Traoré himself. With multiple threats circling, Russia knew keeping him safe was as important as stabilizing the country. But even as Russia played its part, Traoré wasn't sitting back waiting for someone else to do the work. One of his first major decisions was to tighten the circle around him. The Presidential Guard, the unit responsible for keeping him alive, got a complete overhaul. And this wasn't just switching uniforms or moving people around. Traoré went member by member, checking backgrounds, questioning loyalties, and removing anyone who seemed shaky. Only the most loyal, tested, and trusted stayed, and even they weren't given blind trust. Each one had to pass through serious background checks and internal reviews before being allowed to stand watch over the head of state. Even the most trusted faces weren't given a free pass. President Traoré made sure every single person in his close protection team was put under a microscope. It wasn't enough to have a clean record. He wanted proof. Every name was checked. Their school history, their family background, their past jobs, their political connections, even who they talked to abroad. Nothing was off limits. Only those who cleared every hurdle, every single one, were brought in. These weren't just guards. They were people Traoré knew would never flinch, never fold. People who didn't just protect the man, but the mission he stood for. The new Presidential Guard is now a tight-knit circle of loyal defenders, chosen not only for their skills, but for their unwavering commitment to both Traoré and the future of Burkina Faso. With these changes locked in, and with Russia standing firm at his side, Traoré has built a defence system that's harder to crack than ever before. His enemies aren't just up against tanks and jets now, they're up against loyalty, discipline, and a leader who refuses to back down.